There are loads of different unit types to use in Total War Warhammer, but I, at the end of the day, am a cavalryman. So I thought it might be fun to go ahead and put up a just quick little YouTube video of some example formations, just for stuff to do with the melee cavalry in Total War Warhammer, some of the stuff I like to do at least. Now, these formations I'm going to show are almost certainly no good for cheesing. I don't know about that necessarily, I'm not an expert, but there's plenty of YouTube videos up there for that already if you're into that sort of thing. They're also probably not any good for multiplayer, because I generally use pretty tight formations. After all, I'm playing single player against the AI. The AI isn't competent enough with wind spells or vortex spells to really take advantage of tight formations, but a player absolutely would. So if you do want to use any of these in multiplayer, at your own risk, you definitely are going to want to loosen them up a little bit. But right here, I've just got a very basic Empire army right here of just swordsmen, archers, knights. And with that, I guess the most basic formation would probably be just what the game tends to give you by default, which is putting the cavalry on the flanks. And by all means, like, there's no shame in using this one. I use this one a lot. You know, a lot of times I don't feel like going with special formations. It's just very reliant on using the cavalry as kind of as much of a defensive measure as an offensive measure. Because, at least in this particular case, I'm using it to protect my missiles on top of the usual cavalry rolls. So here we're just going to be wanting to wait for the enemy to come to us. This very basic Empire formation they've got running. Now, the AI is not very smart, so they're probably going to charge their knights directly into my swordsmen, even though that leaves their knights wide open. But, leaving our knights out like this, we can choose to instead try and intercept their cavalry, which is what we're going to do now. Now, you have to kind of make judgments here depending on what kind of setups you've got for your cavalry and your infantry. Like here, our Empire Knights are going to be equivalent to theirs, so we're not going to just be able to beat them by ourselves. So we're going to have the archers support them. However, you don't really need to worry about that if you're playing, let's say, Bretonnia or the Vampire Counts, and your cavalry is just full-on better than theirs. There are little things with every formation that you need to make modifications to. And that's a lot of the fun of Total War Warhammer, is just making your own modifications and playing the game your way. Eventually, the plan is for our knights to beat theirs, though in this particular arrangement, it's unsure what will happen because of their missiles and their general. And eventually, when our knights do win, which will go ahead and speed up time, the plan is then you use your knights to take out their missiles after your flankers pretty well win the engagement with their flanks. It's kind of a general role that can even be used with sometimes units that aren't necessarily cavalry, like Dwarf Slayers. But yeah, this is just a very basic formation, but it's still one that's pretty happy to use. Now, as for a more creative formation, or well, perhaps not creative, it's more historically used, I want to say, but still one that's a bit unusual with how Total War is usually balanced, there's the next one. Now, being the cavalryman that I am, as you can imagine, I'm a pretty big fan of Bretonnia, pretty well the cavalry army of Total War Warhammer. And one thing I like to do while playing them is build armies mostly comprised of cavalry. We have no real front line here, we just have Knights Errant and Knights of the Realm. We do have still some peasant units to handle the stinky, dishonorable work of missile units, but at the end of the day, I think it's not only more thematic, but just more fun and more experimental to, with some of the armies like Bretonnia, try and build armies that are mostly, if not all, cavalry. So what I've got set up here is I want the Knights Errant to actually be my front line. And whether or not you turn on Lance formation doesn't really matter to me. I honestly don't notice that much of a difference, personally. I like to turn it on just because I find it thematic. I know there are some people out there who really don't like Lance formation and think it makes the units noticeably worse. I can't say I've noticed the same. Honestly, I encourage people to do their own experiments. You know, custom battle is free for anyone to play, you know. You can just open it up. Well, I guess now it's called Skirmish versus AI, isn't it? Either which way, I have just this basic formation set up. And what I've got here is Knights Errant in the front. And their job would probably be to charge into the infantry while the Knights of the Realm here, who have more anti-large and better charge bonus, try to intercept the opponent's knights. In this particular situation, we would have cavalry superiority because Knights of the Realm are better than regular Empire Knights. But the AI usually instead prefers to try and charge the Empire Knights into my front line. So the job will still be for the Knights of the Realm to intercept them, but in this particular case, let's see. We will go ahead and speed up time, and we will see the Empire Knights try to charge towards my Knights Errant. And instead they will be intercepted and charged kind of in two different directions by my Bretonnian Knights. And they will not do too well taking on 2 units of Knights by themselves. And what I do when I have done that is then pull the Knights Errant out because they have better charge bonuses. For Bretonnia, this is always a solid setup just because Bretonnia has such delineated tiers of cavalry. And there are several races that do, but if you're playing, let's say, the High Elves really only have 2 tiers of Knight, and the Dragon Princes are too expensive to use suicidally. But I try to have one cheaper variety of Knight that I use more as kind of like a high-speed holding unit, and one that I use more for charging. I know that for the modern Total War player, especially if you're a big cheeser, that sounds insane, because cavalry is not associated with as a holding unit for most people. But it can actually do the job pretty decently as long as you have discretion and understand, you know, they're not going to hold their own against spears or halberdiers. But, yeah, this is actually working out even better than I expected. Yep, next formation. So this is a bit more of an experimental one that I can't guarantee quality results, but it's just fun to play around with, which is just trying to do checkerboard formation, which if you've observed any of my past formation videos, or pretty well just any of the strategy guys here with Total War YouTube, you've probably already seen it, but I was just playing around with the idea of cavalry-based checkerboard. And this can only be done in a few situations, especially because if you're going to be using for the cavalry for this, unless you've got an unreasonable amount of cavalry, your missiles are going to have to be able to defend themselves, which is why I picked High Elves here, since their missiles are usually pretty solid at self-defense. But while I was fiddling around with this, you know, the basic checkerboard formation, for those who aren't aware, is the opponent coming in. The more fragile units are in the... It's like the spaces on a checkerboard, right? Black and white alternating. And the units that are in the rear spaces are generally the more vulnerable ones. You want to keep them back there and the more defensive ones in front. And if the opponent tries to ignore your more defensive units and get at your more fragile ones, then they get kind of stuck in between these 2 units that wind up flanking them. However, the AI is having a bit of a weird reaction to it, largely, I think, because I picked High Elves, and so, you know, a good chunk of my army is anti-large. See, the AI, for whatever reason, as you've probably seen already in several of the formations I've shown, the AI is very aggressive with its cavalry and insists on sending the cavalry in first. However, I have anti-large frontline, anti-large missile units, both of which are bad for fighting cavalry. So the AI instead decides to send their cavalry all the way around my army to charge at my cavalry that I've got sitting in the rear. It's a pretty good example of no plan survives contact, I suppose. So, yeah, this variation, this formation right here probably requires some extra experimentation here if you really want it to work like intended and go through the enemy front line rather than just having the enemy front line ignore you. Yeah, still fun to experiment with, though. By all means, like, that's half the point of these videos, really, is go into custom battle, or if you're daring enough, in campaign, and fiddle around and see what you can experiment with. So this is one formation that makes use of a strategy that Zerkovich, at one point, made a video about, and I was quite fond of. He called the strategy Overpower, basically, just one word. Which, you know, quick and snappy, but doesn't necessarily make itself clear. After all, that seems like an obvious thing to want in a strategy game, is to overpower the enemy. But the idea is to overpower on one flank, and perhaps underpower on the other. In this particular situation, I've got a Norskin army here, and I'm not going to put anything on this flank. It's going to be left wide open. The AI is too dumb to take advantage, but you can build a strategy around what to do if the AI does take advantage. And the idea here is that the flanker that the opponent sends, because the AI will always take the most obvious, boring strat of just put a flanker on either flank, The goal is to just annihilate these Empire Knights, giving our cavalry and missiles free reign at their missiles and their back line. Now, with that said, in playtesting, even though I've got a front line of Marauder Spearmen, who, you know, have charge defense, charge reflection, and anti-large, the AI inexplicably seems to be really fond of charging their cavalry directly into the front line of spears. I don't know why. Ordinarily, the plan would be to send my missiles and my cavalry after the opponent's cavalry. However, it's just not been something I've been able to do in testing, at least yet. So, in this case, I guess we can still overpower on one flank, but the idea would instead be to hit the opponent's... Ah, here we go. They seem to be at least somewhat going for it. If you apparently don't have to worry about the opponent's flankers, then feel free to just run roughshod over their back line for free. Okay, now as you can see, the opponent's cavalry still has made a kind of half-assed decision to go after my spearmen, so I can still take advantage. Meanwhile, their cavalry is now going after my missiles. It's an acceptable loss. They're only Marauder Hunters. They're not really that good. And now I will send my Marauder Cavalry to go after their archers, who are pretty bad. Some of my Marauder Horsemen were caught up in the Empire Swordsmen. It's not really the end of the world. I'll still send my Empire Swordsmen to go help with that, just because they would be more useful for it. And, yeah, the Empire Knights actually aren't doing that good of a job fighting the Marauder Hunters anyways. Odd. But, yeah, it's generally a strat where you want to focus on crushing the flanker and then crushing the back line. You know, it's more of a strategy that's solid for when you don't have cavalry superiority, which Norska almost never does, which is why I picked them. But as a race with stronger cavalry superiority or monster superiority, like, let's say, Bretonnia or the Greenskins, then this can be a really powerful one just to guarantee you wipe out the enemy flank near immediately. Alright, and the next formation. This is another experimental but fun one that I've only just came up with the other day, so I haven't put it through a ton of testing, but I'm having a ball with it nonetheless. It's one that I think is a bit more useful perhaps with Kislev, since Kislev has so much in the way of hybrid infantry, but it's one where I set up the melee and missile infantry to be in two separate chunks, which is ordinarily not something I would do, because that would mean that they can't support each other very quickly. But then I leave the cavalry kind of in reserve in the rear here. That way the AI shouldn't try and charge for it. Now, the plan is the missiles here, the Kossars shoot at the enemies and draw them near, allowing the cavalry that's in reserve here to strike out and hit the enemy in the rear. Now, like I said, it's good because Kossars are hybrid missile and melee units. So they're not lost in melee, but they've got the missiles to distract the enemy. But they've also got the By Our Blood ability that all Kislevites have, where they become unbreakable whenever they start routing. Now, you can't get too antsy here. You can't get too easily spooked here. The Kossars, you have to be willing to let some of them die. And by all means, this is probably not a super efficient campaign strat, but that's not what I'm aiming for here. I'm aiming to have fun. And besides, it's Kislev. Kossars giving their life as part of their culture. Now, once the enemy has actually started engaging with your Kossars, that's when I say you should move in. And you want to aim to flank as much as possible. It differs depending on what cavalry unit you're using. Some cavalry units are more expendable than others. Some cavalry units are better at face charges. Some cavalry units are better at rear charges. Winged Lancers, you very much want to get rear charges if you can. They cause fear, they get good charge bonus, they got high speed, they're very well built for it. Whereas, let's say, Empire Knights have a bit more stability, a bit more melee defense, a bit more armor. So, you'd ordinarily expect them to be a bit more better in sustained combat. You want to, here in this particular situation, be very careful about the enemy's own cavalry, because they can intercept your cavalry, and cutting down, you know, the Winged Lancers can't really stand up to Empire Knights in direct combat because of the relative differences in melee defense, armor, like I said. But, you know, as long as you can outmaneuver them and make sure they're outnumbered at all times, then they shouldn't be a problem, and you can make this work. Now, our right side here is utterly routed, but we should be able to work around it as long as we got proper micro. Cavalry is something that you want proper micro to work with. If you don't want to bother with micromanagement, that is perfectly fine. But cavalry, generally speaking, if you don't enjoy microing, then for cavalry, you're probably better off with Grail Guardians or Empire Knights, or more specifically Reichsguard if you're playing the Empire. Generally, cavalry that doesn't require much micro. Monstrous cavalry fits in that group too. I mean, depending on how much you hate micro, you're probably just better off going with the dwarves. But I think I've already gotten across this formation well enough here. And now we're going to have to readjust because one side has fallen, the other side hasn't. But I think I've got the point across. I definitely encourage anyone watching this video to come up with their own cavalry formations. Cavalry is a lot of fun to use, at least for me. Like I said, I'm a cavalry man. They're very flexible units, and there's just something very, very satisfying about seeing a successful charge. So, I think there's just a lot of realm to explore here, and I personally, for all my time with cavalry, have only found, like, the slightest of things you can do. So, have fun. And I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was helpful for at least someone, inspired at least someone to make their own kind of formations. Hell, make your own YouTube video. Go ahead. That's what I'm doing right now as we speak. So, either which way, I will see you folks later. Oh, I hate having to route the Lord last. That's terrible!